Hey everyone, so we're at Corsair's lab here in California, and you might remember JonnyGuru.com. So we have Jonny Guru himself here working at Corsair these days. John, you are Director of Power Supply R&D at Corsair, and we're going to talk about some common misconceptions for power supplies. So this is something that I know you have a lot of thoughts on from both Jonny Guru and now on the manufacturing side. It should be a fun video and hopefully educational as well.
Yep, cool.
But worst case scenario, we get some ranting. So.
Yeah, well, I'm good at that.
Before that, this video is brought to you by Lexar's Hades RGB RAM. Lexar's Hades RAM is available in DDR4 3200 and DDR4 3600 options and specializes by allowing LED synchronization, including for color, intensity, and speed changes. Lexar's Hades is looking to compete on both quality and price, and the RGB LEDs allow for easy matching with any build's color profile. Learn more at the link in the description below. I want to start with this because I think it's the most interesting. So, modular cables, right? We've already covered this to death, where don't mix and match modular cables. I think most people watching the channel know that, and if you don't mix and match modular cables.
We've even had to print on here, designed for use with genuine Corsair Type 4 cables only.
Right. And so the reason for that is because if you take, even between the same brand...
Yeah, you can have different, depending on who the ODM is. If they don't have somebody in-house that says, make this the pinout, then the manufacturer use whatever their default pinout is.
Right.
And you can end up with different pinouts for different models within the same manufacturer.
Right.
Not same manufacturer, but same brand.
Yeah, and so just to be clear, the pinout on the motherboard or the component, that's standardized. The pinout on the back of the power supply is not, and we've covered that part, so that's not the misconception. Right. The misconception, or the question I have for you, every time we talk about this, the top comment is, why don't they just standardize that?
Right, right. It's really kind of a funny answer, and I was around at the time. I'm that old. That when modular power supplies, a relatively young thing, right? It came out probably almost 20 years ago. Okay. So 20 years ago, though, one person came out with this idea, and everybody saw it as a revelation, right? But then everybody kind of did their own riff on that because of different costs. So, like, one of the original fully modular power supplies, or even semi-modular for that matter, had 1-to-1 pins. Well, that's a pain in the neck on the PCB because you have 3.3 volt here, 3.3 volt here, 5 volt here, 5 volt here, 12 volt here, 12 volt, right? So somebody else came along and said, okay, let's make all the 12 volt here, all the 5 volt here, all the 3 volt 3 here, right? To make it easier to lay out the PCB. So you've got, in this very, very short period of time, like within 2 years, everybody has a modular power supply on the market. These guys aren't talking to each other, they're competitors, right? So they all have different pinouts, right? So years go by, everybody's competing against each other, and these factories, for the most part, have standardized within their own factory their pinout, right?
So then, you as a manufacturer, at least in this time, you move around between factories too. Your pinout might change?
No,
anyway?
because in our PRD, which is product requirement document, we always define, regardless who's making the power supply, this is the pinout we want because we want the cables to be interchangeable.
Right.
Now, mind you, we didn't start this standardization until about 12 years ago. Because before that, if it came from factory A, it had this pinout, factory B, it had this pinout. So eventually we came up with Type 1, and that evolved to Type 2.
Right.
And then Type 3, which is the biggest kind, that one stretched for like 10 years. And then Type 4, where the only difference between Type 4 and Type 3 is we add the sense pins to the 24 pin. So you'll notice that there's actually 28 pins here.
Right.
But all these are still the same. Type 3 or Type 4 doesn't matter. Okay. But we did that to make sure that cables we sell work in all of our power supplies. And then we define it. We say it's Type 3, Type 4. To make it in plain English, these are two different types.
So does this boil down to, now that it's still fairly new, but it's matured more now, does this boil down to each manufacturer sort of thinks that their solution is better than their competitor?
Absolutely.
Okay.
But the good news is, so like, I'm not going to name brands, but there is a brand that uses the same OEM that we use for a lot of our products.
Right.
And their power supplies, I've seen they have like 5 different pinouts.
Yeah.
Like across current product.
I know what you're talking about.
Right?
Yeah.
But I've noticed now their newest product from one of the OEMs that we share are using Type 4 cables. And then some of the new guys to the market, they don't want to necessarily be in the cable business. They want to be in the power supply business. So they're adopting existing pinouts, right? Which is great if you're selling cables, because now you're not sitting there going, I have this cable for this brand, this cable for this brand, this cable for this brand. You can say, I got this cable, fits Corsair, XPG, Bitfinex, and you go down the line, it fits all of these. So we are kind of moving towards some standardization, but there's some stubborn outliners, like you said, that think theirs is better. We're just going to
We're doing it our way. Yeah. Is, just for clarity here, is Type 4, is that Corsair naming, or is that?
That's Corsair naming.
Okay.
Yeah.
I see.
So you won't see other people say Type 4, but
they might be using the.
But you got these modders out there. They know. I know. It's.
Right. Okay.
They know it's the same, right?
Yeah.
Guys like Cable Mod, they know.
Right.
Yeah.
Does do you foresee it evolving very much beyond this point?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So do you think it moves towards a standard at some, or is it too competitive?
Well, so there's the only reason that you can never say never, right? You can never say there's no reason this should change.
Right.
But we have found reasons to evolve it in some corner cases to justify a Type 5.
Okay.
But we're making sure you can't plug a Type 5 into a 4 or 4 into a 5. So,
right.
Yeah.
Okay.
So if you're the one creating this standard, I'm not saying that it is a standard, but if you want it to be a standard, you're creating it, then you have the responsibility and the capability to lock it up in such a way where people can't plug the wrong cables in.
That makes sense.
So if they do buy brand X and they plug it into your power supply, you can't say, well, that's on me, you can say that's on you.
Right, right.
If I make two different cables and one can plug in and the other can't plug in at all,
right,
okay, then I've done my job.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So then because at that point, if the user's forcing a connection,
if they're trying to jam it in there,
it's already a user error,
right,
to be clear, but it becomes a much more obvious user error.
Exactly.
Okay, I like that answer for this one. Heat sinks, you want to talk about those?
Yeah,
heat sinks have come up more and more in marketing, I think, and we've talked about heat sinks as they relate to motherboards a lot. And you and I were talking before we started shooting this, talking about sort of heatsink designs where, like on a motherboard, they'll cover the whole rear I/O with what you were referring to as a tree canopy.
Yeah. And I made the analogy of like when you do an AIO and you're only focusing on cooling the radiators, but you have a whole bunch of components that also need at least some airflow.
Right.
And the same is true with the power supply. So, you'll notice that the heat sinks, a lot of heat sinks, this is kind of an exception, not the rule, because this is a higher end product, but you'll see that it's a very thick aluminum, but then also, see how thick it is there vertically, but also it's cut.
Yeah, it's actually
same here.
And it's finned.
And it's finned. It's cut and it's finned, right? And sometimes, though, you'll just see where it's just a metal plate, right? That's not a bad thing, right? And the reason for it is because that pressure coming down from the fan, you don't want to only rely on the heat coming up from the components to the top of the heatsink before it gets cooled. You want to get the air through it,
right?
Just like you were saying with the motherboard, right? And you have components down there that aren't actively cooled. There's no heat sinks on them at all, but they still get hot.
And on the motherboard example, a lot of the time the VRM, the capacitors closest to the socket, they'll typically be left out of the heat sink.
Yeah, exactly. Like your MOSFETs on the DC to DC. There's no heat sink on them. You've got, capacitors get hot. Capacitors need cooling. There you got a little tiny cap down there. Needs airflow. All this stuff needs some airflow. And if you put a heat sink over the whole thing and the air can't get through it, you're not doing anybody any justice.
But John, then it's a giant heat sink.
It must be great.
It's
yeah,
better.
So much aluminum.
yeah. So it comes back to, I think, probably good.
More is not better.
Right. more surface area can be better, but
it has to be designed right.
It can't create impedance too.
Right. Yeah.
And just being a block that's not cut doesn't create surface area.
If you go to the old school power supplies that weren't really efficient, that generated a lot of heat, remember they had those big heat sinks that went all the way across the whole top? But man, those things had huge cuts in them, right? Because that air just needs to get shoved through there and to the PCB.
Right. Another one, so I liked this one, full bridge rectification.
Oh, yeah.
What
was the term used? Overcompensation?
Yeah. It's basically, well, I'll let you explain it, but when you were explaining it, it sounds like a compensation mechanism. So do you want to walk us through, take us through the scope of why does this come up?
Yeah, so you have your bridge rectification is your your PWM rectification on the AC side, right? And you have half bridge and you have full bridge. And for a higher wattage, you want full bridge because at higher wattage is obvious more power. It's creating more heat and everything like that. You want to dissipate that across as many more components as possible.
Right.
So their full bridge is good. 1200 watt, 1500 watt, 1800 watt, whatever.
Sure.
If you have a 750 watt and it's full bridge, you actually have to be suspect because you're putting twice as many components in there when it's not supposed to be generating that much heat. And what it is you could take a good MOSFET, let's say like $1.
Right.
You could buy and you could build a half bridge out of it, right? Or you could buy a cheap MOSFET that doesn't have the thermal resistance or thermal
Characteristics.
fortitude that of the better one, right? And get it for 30 cents. But it can't even support 750 watt in a bridge, right? So what do? You just double it up. There's your full bridge, right?
Right.
So
for the wrong reason.
Right. So you spent less money, you've got full bridge, you're doing the same job. It kind of works.
Right.
But the disadvantage is you can increase, the more components you have, the more resistance you create, so lowers efficiency. And of course, twice as many components is going to take up twice as much space, right? So
I would imagine too it introduces more chance for something to go wrong.
And of course, that's always a thing. The more parts you have, the more potential for failure.
Right.
Yeah. So.
So I like that one. 'Cause I guess you had seen in forums or something people talking about if something's full bridge versus not, and that's not necessarily an indicator.
You really have to dig down and see what they're using, and pretty much at the high level, I don't even look at it, right? Because it's not. Unless you dig in and you have the data sheets for the individual components, you're not explaining anything to anybody by just saying it's full bridge.
Right.
That's just a bullet point, right? It's full bridge. So,
what does that mean?
My car has 4 wheels.
Yeah, right. I want to ask this: tier lists. How do you feel about? You know what I'm talking about, right?
They've gotten better because they're actually using review data. It used to be people would just grab a brand and say,
And this one's always tier 1.
These guys always make the best stuff. Right. But and they're looking at things like the topology. Is it double forward? Is it LLC on the primary side? They're looking at the secondary. Is it group regulated? Does it use DC to DC? So they're taking in a lot more of the technical information than before. The only difference is until they see a corner case of something not functioning properly, like the experience you had, right. you said it, not me.
I realized it as I said it, like, he's probably trying to avoid.
That would be something that would appear higher on the list until something like that happened.
Right. That makes sense. Yeah.
And there's no way you can test for everything unless you have the proper equipment. And very few people have the proper equipment.
Yeah, and there's.
And if I'm blowing stuff up in here, I mean, we get competitors' power supplies in here every single day. And if I'm blowing stuff up, I'm not going out there and telling everybody, "Hey, guess what I blew up?" That's bad for everybody, right? It's bad for me. It's bad for them.
Glass house, too. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. I'm waiting for you to burn me, and my time is coming. I'm sure.
Next one, types of fan we were talking about.
Yeah.
So this is actually let's start with the FDB topic.
Okay. Yeah.
So fluid dynamic bearing. Would be the bullet point you might see on a spec sheet.
So this one really frustrates me because so few people actually tear into the fan and actually look at the bearing. They just ask the vendor, "Hey, what kind of bearing is this?" "Oh, it's an FDB." I've seen so many fans that are FDB that are just rifle bearing.
Right. Yeah.
Or they might just use the word hydro bearing or something like that, but it's still just a rifle bearing.
That I see a lot. I see a lot of renaming of the bearing to.
I don't have anything against rifle bearings. Rifle bearings are great. They last as long as the power supply, especially if you have a 0 RPM fan.
I don't have a problem with them, but also they shouldn't lie about what's in it.
Exactly.
Right?
I have a problem with misrepresenting the product, right? So an FDB fan, you're rifled on the inside, which is really hard to make because if you look at those riflings, they are microscopic. So you're trying to get inside this brass bushing and put these microscopic swirls in there, not an easy thing to do. Rifle bearing, the rifling is on the outside. Still microscopic almost, but it's on the outside, so it's easier to QC, right? Whereas a rifle bearing is just a brass bushing.
Yeah.
So they'll take one that's rifled on the outside instead of the inside and say it's fluid dynamic bearing. And they can get away with that more now than before because the patent's up. Matsushita no longer has a patent on it.
So it's open. Yeah.
So anybody can use the term fluid dynamic bearing, and anybody can, whether it's fluid dynamic bearing or not, and anybody can make fluid dynamic bearing if they have the technology to do so.
Right.
So it's a slippery slope.
Yeah. And you were also talking about so pressure for fans.
Yeah. So
especially relating to heat sinks, I guess.
Yeah. Well, we use the term static pressure, but it's more static pressure than what you would use for a radiator because it is more obstructive, right? So when you have something like the RMX here that has the maglev fan, you'll notice the blade shape is a little different than the one you would use in your case, because it is cramming more air in a straight, as opposed to a conical. And the more static pressure you have, of course, it's less conical.
Right.
Right. So you have blade shape, blade length, right? So if your hub is larger, obviously your blades can't be as large.
Right.
So all that stuff comes into play. And then, a lot of it is the airflow. You'll notice that a lot of power supplies have a very, very similar layout. The transformer's in the middle because the transformer doesn't get that hot. So it can be under the hub. And then you have less critical components, like here's your modular interface, your DC to DC. That's going to be farthest away from the exhaust because they don't need as much cooling. And then you have the components that really get hot, like your bridge rectifier, right here by the exhaust. It's going to get the bulk of the air coming through from the fan. So there is a method to the madness of the layout.
Right. And then in terms of resistance and why you would need actually I can rope this back into the misconceptions topic too. So I've seen content where over the years people will replace power supply fans to try and get something maybe quieter or better, put Noctua in there, whatever.
But if it's not as much static pressure though, you'll find a lot of that air just kind of floats right out the back here, and then you run into that same problem you have with the tree canopy.
Right. So so the air will end up, if it's more
it'll just kind of bounce off and go right out the
hits
back.
And finds the
you
path
really
of
need to
least
just
resistance.
push it down as
as
hard, I guess you say, as hard as possible.
That makes sense.
Because you want it to go through the heat sinks, you want it to go into the PCB.
Well, and through all of this, you've got adhesive.
That's what I'm saying. Yeah, it needs to go right through all that stuff. You don't want it bouncing.
Right. Last one I want to bring up for this, unless you have others you want to throw in there. So we've talked. Everyone I think has talked the 80 plus topic to death at this point. But just to pull one aspect out of that is, I still see just buy 80 plus gold and you'll be fine.
Right.
And like ignoring the other thing that we did separately, I guess it'd help if you walk through some of the factors.
It's really simple. I mean, if you really look at what 80 plus is, what it is, and they've done a great job. I mean, there's, definitely being green is a good thing, right?
Right.
And if it's more efficient, you're using less AC power to create DC power, so therefore you're putting less strain on the grid. That's not a bad thing.
Right.
The problem is when they test the power supplies, they test the room temperature, they're not looking at voltage regulation, they're not looking at ripple, they're not looking at all these other things that make a power supply good or bad. They're only looking at how much AC is converted to DC, and that's it.
Yeah, efficiency, right?
So there's no level of quality, they don't know if it's going to last a year, 5 years, 10 years, it's none of that is tested. And nor do they want to test that, and I don't blame them because that's not their job. Their job is to say this is 92% efficient at 50% load. Whatever.
Well, you get into a quagmire, I think, too. You start looking at all that. Because they don't, if I remember correctly from our piece, protections are not evaluated, right?
No.
Right.
They have a formula that calculates 10%, 20%, 10%, 25%, 50%, and 100%.
Right.
And they just tested that. Boom, 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 boom. Here's your paper. We're good.
Right.
That's it.
Right. Should we, I feel like I'd like to mention Cybenetics here as well for what Eris is working on. So on that end, as we start seeing that getting referenced more online, what aspects of that do you feel fill in or provide more detail than where 80 plus is lacking?
It basically exposes everything that 80 plus would lack or lacks to give you an idea of what you're paying for, right? So he does so much more than efficiency. The thing is he offers up the badges, right? I'm like, okay, the badges are cool, but to me, just having the badge says he's tested it.
Right.
Not that it's this efficiency or this noise level.
That makes sense, yeah.
If you find the badge, then you can go to the website and you can pull up the full report. And the full report has everything. And that's where it's cool, right? Because he does test for regulation of ripple and even audible noise and all the things that, since he's been a reviewer for 20 years, a reviewer would do.
Right.
Right? So that's a good thing about it. So it's almost like you're getting this guarantee from a third party that actually knows what he's doing and knows what to look for to give you the thumbs up that your product is good enough for him.
Right. Yeah, it's a reviewer's perspective on it, which I like, because that means it's more of a
that's how I got a job here, right? Yeah, they wanted a reviewer's perspective on the product because, and sure enough, I mean, like I was telling you earlier, we have so many eyes on the products. We read the reviews, we have, Intel helping us and Cybenetics helping us, and we have 3 labs in 3 countries, right? And it's because the more eyes you have, the more you're going to find mistakes, right? If you just have one lab in a factory and they're just testing what's coming off the line, that's not good enough, because they're going to have the set test protocol and they're only going to test without going outside of parameters. So it's a good thing.
Yeah, so if you want more of this type of stuff, we're planning to do one more while we're here, and then we've got, actually, it was a factory tour of one that you all have used in the past too, so you can check that out. We'll link it below. But thank you for joining for this and for the walkthrough. And check back for the next one.